about the issue of cost? I mean, I know that cloud computing is great. Magic idea is the idea of moving the cost from capex to opex. I mean, what about Azure with cost in terms of the different platforms? And Greg, I think again it was you might have mentioned this, that either NoSQL or as a cheaper alternative. But in general, what do you think about cost with Azure? Is it a good deal?
Yeah, so the far and away number one most surprising thing for me was that I have only ever seen the cost measures drop.
Repeatedly.
They've only gone down.
Yeah.
And that's
it's kind of a pricing war going on in the cloud computing right now.
It's absolutely a race.
Right.
Yeah, it's commoditized.
It's a race to the bottom, but yeah, okay.
And so I've had the ability, the fortunate ability to get a tour of one of the Azure data centers. And I had to go through background screening, and it's fully guarded, everything like that.
Right.
But as part of that, I got to see firsthand the expense that they're putting into it, and the recurring effort. And so that's both like monetary and from people and effort, and so I think that's what drives that cost down, and that makes them on the same level as Amazon or better, and puts pretty much everyone else kind of to the side or the back burner, because with that amount of effort, it allows them to optimize so much that it just keeps driving that cost down. Yeah. So when I compare that to some of the other, not necessarily what people think of as cloud providers, but just shared hosting or hosting at another data center type thing, I see the prices there either comparable or more expensive. And oftentimes that in the communication, a lot of people look like, I can get a dedicated server for less or something, but when you start looking at the different options of what you're really doing, you really can't. And it comes down to you getting like dedicated CPU cycles versus shared, or what kind of redundancy, as well as the support and the guarantee. Like, there's a lot to it, but I'll let Adam and Eric address.
Eric, what's your sense of the cost of Azure? And I mean, I guess Microsoft is in a fortunate position of this is still early in the game. They can use their deep pockets to cut costs and get a larger market share early on. But do you see there's a cost advantage to Azure versus the other platforms? Can you speak about it that way?
So we want to look at it just versus the other platforms. So not only do they match the other platforms like Adam was saying or Greg was saying earlier. Actually, there's a blog post from Monday of this week on the Windows Azure blog where Stephen Martin, who's the general manager of Windows Azure, said, we're announcing some new pricing, reducing some pricing on these things, and you can always expect that compute, storage, and bandwidth, we will match Amazon.com. So he laid that out in his blog post. Right. Okay. So just expect that. I don't know if that was a warning to Amazon to stop cutting prices because we're just going to race ourselves to the bottom or what. Right. But yeah, expect that is basically what he said. There are some things in Azure though that are even cheaper than Amazon.
Such as.
So one of the things that I've stumbled into, it's minuscule. It's not material, the cost, but storage transactions. So when you communicate back to the storage system, you pay like a penny for every 100,000 transactions that you make to the storage system. And in Amazon, that's a little more expensive. So it's not even so much that we match the prices, but in some cases they're even cheaper, on the Microsoft side. So but it definitely is, in just the compete scenario, they are competing to win. So.
I think we'd also be losing an opportunity right now. I know CloudSpectator.com recently did a study of basically trying to compare the cost of running Linux in the various cloud providers, and they compared Amazon versus AWS versus Rackspace versus HP's offering and things like that. And what they actually did in order to try to equalize those prices, because on a machine-by-machine basis and on a processor-by-processor basis and everything else, we get into these costs per hour that make us look pretty similar to Amazon, right? And I think one of the sort of really surprising things that came out of Cloud Spectator's recent article, and you can find this on their site, is that when you actually run Linux Bench on the various clouds, so you put up a Linux machine, a flavor of Linux on Azure, and yes, we do support Linux, as we've already talked about on that, and Azure and Rackspace and everything else. And then you run Linux bench, and you basically equalize everything to the same IOPS, right? So you basically flatten everything out so that you figure out the cost per IOP, essentially, or how powerful the machine is. Azure turns out to be about 4 times cheaper than Amazon, and Amazon turns out to be far and away 4 times, the most expensive of all those things. And so when you actually equalize across the performance you get even within those, it turns out that it's about 4 times cheaper to run Linux in Azure than it is to run it in Amazon, which I think a lot of people found pretty shocking.
Interesting.
So, and there's a lot, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of variation in that. You may not need a machine of this particular scale, and, your mileage may vary with those numbers, but I think to the extent that we can, what we perform when you flatten for performance against machines, it turns out surprisingly that it's cheaper to run Linux with Microsoft than it is with Amazon. So.
There's an historical irony in there somewhere. I think.
There's more than a there's a lot of irony in there, actually, I think.
But
Eric, we talked about. Go ahead.
I just want to throw in the pricing. Yeah. We're talking about competing across the vendors. But there's also that competition. You have to consider the data center, like the internal data center, as a competitor in terms of a vendor.
Right.
And so it's not. I wouldn't say it's so much that it's the raw cost and that it's cheaper to run in the public cloud than your own data center. However, oftentimes that is the case. It is cheaper to do that. But it's a different model where you can buy the computing power kind of in chunks and incrementally over time. So I can spread that out instead of having to do that in my financials. So I do convert that CapEx to OpEx, number one. But then I don't have to do a great job of estimating exactly where my business is going to be in 2 years. If I were a high-growth startup or even an enterprise that has growth or fluctuations, it allows me to buy over that curve of those utilization fluctuations instead of buying at my peak time or my forecasted peak time, which I may be way off. So
you're talking about on demand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to add a little bit to that. So when I've gone around and talking about implementing full systems for clients, and when I ask them, what are we going to have for an overall CapEx on the infrastructure side, I find more often than not, like the vast majority of the time, that the clients don't actually have knowledgeable data about what their internal costs are. So they may know how much it costs to physically buy a server, but they don't know the overall expenditure with CapEx and OpEx combined. And
they don't even know their own numbers in that regard.
And they really don't. And so oftentimes what happens is, we leave that discussion or that initial assessment of saying, okay, well, for the next 2 to 3 months, start evaluating that, start tracking those metrics. And they usually, like Eric said, it's not always, but usually we'll find that moving to the cloud would be ultimately cheaper if it fits into the rest of the model.